Okay, get ready for a deep dive on a topic that's, well, known for inducing some serious yawns, government deficits.
But don't hit that stop button just yet.
We promise.
This isn't your Econ 101 lecture, folks.
Today, we're talking deficits with a twist what if, and stay with me here, they could actually finance themselves.
Yeah, you heard that right.
Wild, huh?
Like, imagine a world where governments could spend more than they take in without, raising taxes or slashing spending down the line.
Buckle up, listeners, because we're dissecting a real brain bender of an article from the September 2024 issue of Econometrica.
The deficits finance themselves. Catchy, right?
Don't worry, we've done the heavy lifting, crunching through all that dense economic modeling so you don't have to.
Yeah, we're your friendly neighborhood econ nerds here to break it all down.
So what's the article all about? Basically, it throws a wrench in the traditional wisdom. The idea that every dollar the government spends above and beyond its budget means we're on the hook for it later, either through higher taxes or deep cuts to programs.
Right, like this idea that deficits are always a bad thing. This article kind of flips that on its head.
Exactly.
It explores this really intriguing possibility that under the right set of circumstances, running a deficit might actually create the conditions for, get this, its own resolution.
Like deficits canceling themselves out. That sounds almost too good to be true.
Oh, no, right?
So how could a government pull that off? Spend more than it takes in without eventually having to make some tough choices? What's the secret sauce?
Well, the economists behind this study, they started with your typical standard issue economic model, but then they did something really interesting.
Hit me with it.
They injected a dose of reality.
Oh, okay, I like the sound of that already.
They actually factored in stuff that, real people deal with every day, finite lifespans, for starters.
Because none of us are those, perfectly rational economic robots that economists love to model, right?
Exactly. And another thing, the fact that, let's face it, we don't always make the most, shall we say, economically sound decisions in our daily lives.
You're telling me...
Impulse purchases, anyone.
Guilty as charged.
See, and by adding those real-world nuances, those wrinkles into the model, they stumbled upon two key mechanisms that could, and this is where it gets really wild, allow deficits to essentially pay for themselves.
Okay, you've got to give us the goods. What are these magical mechanisms?
All right, so the first one, they call it the tax-based boom.
Tax-based boom has a nice ring to it.
Right. So picture this. The government inject a bunch of money into the economy, right?
Think stimulus checks or something?
Exactly. And that influx of cash, it doesn't just disappear into thin air.
Right.
It actually has the potential to kickstart economic activity, more people working, businesses humming along, and here's the kicker. More taxable income being generated.
Hold on, so the government spends money, which then boosts the economy, leading to more tax revenue down the line, all without even touching tax rates.
You got it.
It's like the spending pays for itself in a way.
Exactly. Like a virtuous cycle almost.
Okay, that's mechanism number one. What about the second one? This tax-based boom sounds tough to beat.
All right, so this one's a bit trickier, but it all comes down to inflation.
Inflation, everyone's favorite topic, right?
Right. Now, we all know uncontrolled inflation, that's a whole other beast.
Yeah, nobody wants to see prices skyrocketing.
Exactly.
But what if a little bit of inflation,
a little bit, managed carefully,
right, could actually work in our favor?
That's the idea they're exploring.
How so?
Think about it. As prices go up, the real value of what the government owes, that debt, actually goes down.
It's like inflation is secretly chipping away at the debt, little by little.
Exactly. Now, big caveat here, this whole thing only works if inflation stays in check.
Right. If things start spiraling out of control, that's a whole other ballgame.
Absolutely. If prices go haywire, central banks, they're going to step in, try to cool things down.
Which, actually, this study found could end up hindering this whole self-financing process.
Yeah. It's all about finding that sweet spot.
A delicate dance, it seems like.
Exactly.
But when these mechanisms work together, when they're firing on all cylinders, the study suggests something pretty remarkable could happen.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting. They actually found that under very specific kind of ideal conditions, these two mechanisms together, that tax-based boom and that little bit of inflation, they could potentially lead to a situation where deficits are, get this, fully financing themselves.
Wait, hold up. Are you saying deficits could just, poof, disappear?
Not disappear exactly, but more like...
pay for themselves.
Yeah, essentially cover their own costs over time. That's the idea anyway.
Okay, but that's got to be theoretical, right? The real world, it's messy, it's unpredictable.
Oh, absolutely. We're not living in some perfect economic model here.
Right.
But here's the thing, and this is where it gets even more interesting, that Unpredictability, that human element, it might actually be a good thing for this whole self-financing idea.
Oh, really? Now you've got my attention.
So remember how we talked about people not always being like perfectly rational economic actors?
Yeah, like that time I bought those noise-canceling headphones I totally didn't need.
Exactly. Impulse buys, they're practically a national pastime.
Hey, some of us call it supporting the economy.
Right. And that's actually good news for this tax-based boom we were talking about.
How so?
Well, the study, they found that, in general, people tend to spend extra money relatively quickly.
Okay, that tracks with my own personal experience, I'll admit.
Right. It's like that bonus you get at work. Are you going to stash it away in some high-yield savings account?
Definitely not.
Or are you going to treat yourself, maybe book that vacation you've been eyeing?
Vacation it is.
Exactly. And that, my friend, is what fuels the tax-based boom. That quick spending, it injects money right back into the economy, gets things moving faster, which then leads to, you guessed it, more tax revenue.
So our impulsive spending habits, they're actually a good thing for the government's bottom line. Is that what you're saying?
In a way, yeah. It's counterintuitive, right? But that's economics for you, full of surprises.
Always keeping us on our toes.
Exactly.
So we've got people spending their stimulus checks like there's no tomorrow.
Which, hey, good for the economy? Potentially.
Right, but what about the government side of things?
Ah, good point.
Because if they're the ones spending all this extra money, they've got to rein it in eventually, right?
Well, here's the thing. The study also took a look at how quickly governments tend to adjust their fiscal policies.
So like raising taxes, cutting spending, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. The tough choices we were talking about earlier.
Right.
And guess what they found?
What?
Historically, governments are pretty darn slow to make those big adjustments.
So more bureaucratic red tape, more delays. That's actually a good thing in this case.
In this very specific context, it could be. Because the longer those adjustments take to kick in, the more time these self-financing mechanisms have to work their magic.
Okay, so timing is everything.
Timing is crucial, absolutely.
But, and I feel like there's always a but with economics.
There often is.
Everything we've been talking about, it hinges on one big, hairy, unpredictable factor.
And that would be?
Inflation.
Ah, inflation. The elephant in the room, or should we say, the dragon in the economic model.
Right. A little bit of inflation is like that secret ingredient, helps erode the debt.
Exactly. That's what we're hoping for, at least in this scenario.
But too much inflation, forget about it.
Yeah, it's a delicate dance, for sure.
Because if inflation starts running rampant,
then those central banks, they're going to swoop in with their interest rate hikes.
Which can slam the brakes on the economy faster than, you can say, quantitative easing.
Exactly. And that, my friend, that can throw a wrench in the whole self-financing plan.
So it's like this high wire act, this balancing act.
Oh, absolutely.
You've got government spending on one side.
Right.
Consumer behavior, like, will we actually spend those stimulus checks? On the other.
Yeah.
And then looming over it all, you've got the central bank ready to step in if things get too heated.
It's a complex system, to say the least.
It sounds like it.
But here's the thing. All this talk about theoretical models and mechanisms,
Right.
it's all well and good. But how do we know if any of this actually holds up in the real world?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Right. Like, does this self-financing thing have any real-world validity?
It sounds good on paper.
Right.
But does it actually work?
So to answer that, and this is where the rubber really meets the road with the authors of this study, they went a step further.
Okay, tell me more.
They went beyond that basic theoretical model, and they built a much more complex, data-driven model.
So they took this from, like, Econ Theory 101 to something a little more, well, real world.
Exactly. They wanted to see if these self-financing mechanisms, they still hold up when you factor in all the complexities of the real world, you know, the messy data, the unpredictable human behavior.
So they fed the model some real-world data.
Precisely.
And what happened? Did this whole self-financing idea, did it fly or flop?
All right, so get this. One of the things they found, it was actually pretty surprising.
Hit me with it.
They found that when it comes to stimulus checks, sometimes the best policy is, well, no policy.
No policy? What do you mean?
Like doing nothing, no tax hikes after the checks go out, no spending cuts to quote-unquote pay for it, might actually be the best way to cover the cost of those stimulus checks.
Wait, serious?
Yeah, they found that those stimulus checks, with no immediate policy response, they could actually be largely self-financed.
So all that hand-wringing about the national debt.
It might be a bit overblown, at least in this case.
Wow, okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So those stimulus checks, they might have actually paid for themselves. That just sounds too good to be true.
Well, there's always a catch, right?
There was always a catch in me.
The study found that the biggest obstacle to this whole self-financing thing, the thing that could really throw a wrench in the works, is a quote-unquote hawkish central bank.
Hawkish, meaning?
Meaning they're laser-focused on keeping inflation down, even if it means, slowing down the economy a bit.
So even if the government's like playing it cool with the spending, letting those self-financing mechanisms do their thing, the central bank could come in and mess it all up.
Exactly. If they see even a whiff of inflation, they might hit the brakes hard, raising interest rates.
And that can have a ripple effect throughout the whole economy, right?
Absolutely. Higher interest rates, they can slow down borrowing, make it harder for businesses to invest and expand.
Which means the tax-based boom we were talking about?
It might not boom quite as much as we'd hoped.
Wow, it's like this intricate dance, this delicate balance.
That's a great way to put it.
You've got the government spending, you've got people's spending habits, and then you've got the central bank, conducting the whole orchestra.
It's a complex system, that's for sure.
This has really made me rethink how I view deficits. I mean, it's not as simple as just saying deficits are bad, right?
Exactly. It's not that black and white.
There are all these nuances, all these factors at play.
This study, it's not saying that we should just throw caution to the wind and max out the national credit card.
Right. No one's advocating for reckless spending.
But it is a good reminder that deficits, they're not always the bogeyman.
They're not necessarily this looming economic apocalypse.
Exactly. There are circumstances where a little bit of deficit spending, especially if it's done strategically, it can actually be a good thing.
Especially if it gets the economy moving, right?
Exactly. It's all about understanding the bigger picture, all those moving parts.
This has been, without a doubt, one of our most thought-provoking deep dives yet.
I agree.
We've learned that deficits, they're not always public enemy number one. They can actually, under the right conditions, finance themselves.
It's a paradigm shift for sure.
It really is. And for our listeners, next time you hear someone railing against the evils of government debt, remember this conversation.
There's always more to the story.
Always more to explore. That's what we're all about here on The Deep Dive.
Until next time.
Keep those brains engaged, and we'll see you in the next episode.